Thank you very much. Well, if I was playing for Boston, I suppose you could say that I'm batting cleanup, except that when you're batting cleanup, that's supposed to be the home run hitter, and having come with no opportunity to prepare, I can't do that. So I'm going to have to steal a few bases here if I'm going to make an impact. I was really delighted to come to this conference because of the notion that it is an opportunity for a civil, calm, and considered review of what is undoubtedly one of the most important public policy issues in the world today. Certainly one of the most important public policy issues in Canada. And so I want to give you my perspective as someone who spent his entire career in the public policy area. And what that does is it gives me a sense really of what makes for good public policy and what makes for a good public policy framework, as well as, if you will, the role that the climate change issue might be considered to have in terms of affecting the quality of our democracies, and in Canada's case, the existence of our federation. We have some very significant dichotomies that affect the way in which climate change is discussed in Canada. On the one hand, there are a significant number of Canadians, including the Canadian federal government and many others, who are struck by the scientific message, if you will, the message that's coming out of several scientific authorities, that indeed climate change poses an enormous threat to the climate, to the planet, indeed. And that unless significant action is taken to fundamentally transform the energy economy of the world, we face catastrophe. One can argue about the timelines for that, but the argument is we face catastrophe. So we have to take, in effect, emergency action. We have to do something very, very quickly. And some have even presented that as fundamentally as a moral issue. If these catastrophes are allowed to happen, or even if the regional impacts of some of the anticipated effects occur, it will disproportionately affect the poorer parts of the planet. And on the other hand, there are those who are skeptical, if you will, about that proposition, and prefer to view climate change as yet another public policy issue that needs to be addressed the way all public policy issues are. And I think it's useful to kind of stand back and think about the way in which we deal with public policy issues generally. In Canada, and I'm sure here in the United States and in most other countries, we have a pluralistic society. We have many, many different interests. We have different regions. We have different political parties. We have different voices that strive to be heard and that want to influence the outcome of policy. And we have multiple objectives. Yes, we highly value environmental quality, but we also want economic growth. We want safety and security. We want health. We want to ensure that our regions play an appropriate role within the Federation, and we want to ensure national unity. And there are other public policy goals. The tasks for people who work in government, whether as politicians or as public servants, as I was, is to strive to find the optimum among balancing all of those different tools. So one of the things that makes climate policy, or the climate debate in particular, so difficult is that the insistence that this poses a catastrophe and that the planet is at stake gives rise to a demand that it transcend all other public policy objectives. And so there are trade-offs to be made, but people will argue about the nature of those trade-offs. That has affected the ability of people to have a kind of a calm and rational debate about it. There's been, there's too much name calling, on both sides of the issue. And that it impairs the possibility to have a really healthy public dialogue. And I mean, hopefully conferences like this will go a long way to solving that, but it's not solved in Canada, I can quite assure you. And so people step back from discussing the objectives or the targets, and they start talking about the instruments. The debates become all about to what extent should we subsidize or not subsidize? To what extent should we impose taxes, carbon taxes, cap and trade systems? How should we use the revenues? And in Canada, there's a third dimension of this because our resource industries represent such a significant portion of our total greenhouse gas emissions. To what extent should we actually constrain the development and transportation of our resources to market? All of these have given rise to tremendous stresses within Confederation. Because there are some parts of Canada that are like the province of Quebec, for example, which are very heavily dependent upon hydro-generated electricity, and is really not all that dependent upon fossil fuels, except for in transportation and other areas of the economy. And then there is much of Western Canada, particularly Saskatchewan and Alberta, and increasingly Newfoundland and Labrador, and someday Northern Canada, where the development of our oil and mineral resources represents one of the most significant economic opportunities that they have for their future. Those who are most concerned about the growth of emissions are basically saying we have to shut those industries down. Not only do we have to shut those industries down, but we have to shut down all energy-intensive industries, which takes one not only into the oil and gas and minerals, but petrochemicals, steel, cement, and many other industries that are really central to the economies of central Canada as well as the West. The response to that, as you might imagine, in Western Canada has been profound. I mean, the debate over that and over carbon taxes is so severe at this juncture that it is probably one of the most divisive issues in the country. You know, we used to worry about the French-English divide and so on. Well, that's largely put to bed, one hopes. But now, you know, we find our federation, frankly, at risk over this debate. And that's very worrisome. It's very worrisome. As a federal country, the United States may find increasingly that you have sharp divergences between the positions of the different states. You know, a degradation, if you will, in the public dialogue, a questioning of the capacity of governments. And I'll pick up on that theme a little bit further, because, particularly with respect to carbon taxes. Carbon taxes, economists agree, as has been said here today, is in principle the most desirable public policy instrument to be used to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, if they are accompanied by an appropriate set of other measures. And it's important to consider what those other measures are. If you do not add them on to a whole package of regulations and programs and other government interventions that in fact add to the cost of the impacts that the taxes would have. In Canada, we have a vast panoply of programs in place at the federal government level, but at the provincial level, there are over 280 different separate programs that are intended to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in one sector of the economy or another. There are so many different climate change response programs in place that no one knows what the cost of them are. And we can be virtually certain that they're highly duplicative and so on. But there is such a, if you will, a steamroller effect of constantly adding and adding and adding to the response that with it we've led to this multiplication. So, is there any sign that governments are prepared to do away with those programs and substitute effective, efficient carbon taxes in place? Not at all. The other key principle, of course, is that you should be able to ensure that the net effect of carbon taxes on the economy is not a depressing one. All taxes impose a deadweight loss on the economy, frankly. So, you know, you have to find a way of compensating for that. And proposals have been made, well, then we'll recycle it. Well, the ideal way of recycling it would be to reduce the rates of existing generally applied taxes, like income taxes or sales taxes and so on. But that's not what has happened in Canada. In fact, what has happened in the jurisdictions that have implemented carbon taxes so far has been that most of the revenues have been used to fund new programs. I work for politicians, and I have enormous respect for people who spend their life in politics, but they do love to spend. You know, and I worked in our Department of Finance for a period of time. I've worked in Treasury departments. Treasury departments cannot be trusted to give the money back. They will either reduce the deficit or they'll spend it. And so the ideal of having a revenue neutral carbon tax will remain just that. It's an ideal. Our experience, and I understand from work that's been done in France, the experience of all of the 40 jurisdictions in the world in which carbon taxes are currently in place, is that well less than a third of the carbon tax revenues that are received are ultimately returned back to the public directly. So what you end up with is a wider impact. The third element, and there are other considerations, of course, are the competitive effects. And in Canada's case, we are quickly moving up a ramp in which we will add $10 to the level of carbon taxes each year until we reach $50 per ton by 2022, but with the implication that that will go on rising thereafter, so that by 2030 it could well be $100 a ton and increasing. By that stage, incidentally, at $100 per ton, the revenues from carbon taxes will rival those from our personal income tax. So it's an enormous amount of money, and recycling that would have been a challenge in any case. So we're having difficulty figuring out how to do that, but we're also concerned about the impact of that upon Canadian industry, especially if the United States does not implement a carbon tax regime. For a country like Canada that is so intimately integrated with the US economy, to do so is a severe risk to the health of our industry and to our ability of our companies to attract investment and to compete in future. So that for us is, we've got to think very carefully about this. I'm not going to speak much longer because as you can tell, I'm not really prepared for this, but having seen what the experience is in Canada, the appeal that I would make to all of you who care about this issue and want to think it through is the need to have a more civilized approach to developing consensus on these issues. They are difficult. They do involve very difficult technical issues that the average citizen has difficulty coming to grips with. But they are not necessarily any more difficult than the issues that we have had to deal with in the past in dealing with poverty, and dealing with regional issues, and dealing with social justice, and dealing with security, and dealing with immigration. They're all difficult issues. And they can only be resolved if we have respect for one another. And that's the way forward that I see as the possible solution for Canada, and I certainly hope that you have the same solution here. Thank you.